Hi, Elizabeth. Good afternoon. Start off by thanking everybody for being here today for this webinar presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman in partnership with the Behaviorally Informed Organizations Partnership. Although we are meeting virtually, we wish to acknowledge the land on which this University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are enormously grateful to have this opportunity to work on the land. My name is Matt Hilchey. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow with BIOrg, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. We are delighted today to have Elizabeth Linos, Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. Before I introduce Elizabeth, as always, I'll go over the ground rules for this webinar. Following my introduction of our speaker will deliver a 30 to 35-minute presentation. During that presentation, I'm encouraging the audience to submit questions for our speaker by clicking on the Q&A tab at the top or bottom of your Zoom screen and typing into the entry box. At the end of the talk, and if we still have the time, I'll host a question and answer session in which I'll select questions from the Q&A tab to ask our speaker. All right, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Linos. Elizabeth is a behavioral scientist and public management scholar. The majority of her research focuses on how to improve government by focusing on its people. Specifically, her studies consider how we can improve diversity in recruitment and selection, how to reduce burnout at work, and how different work environments affect performance and motivation in government. In her research on behavioral public administration, she also studies how to use low-cost nudges to reduce administrative burdens and to improve overall resident-state interactions. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here today. I know that you have another talk at 1:15, so this is great that you're here, especially with that tight timeline. And if you're all set, I'll get you to take it away.
Thanks so much, Matt. And it is a pleasure to be here, notwithstanding other talks notwithstanding. Let me see if I can share my screen correctly. And Matt, can you confirm that you are seeing my slides?
Yes, I can.
Great. Well, I can't see all of you, but I'm glad you're here to talk about this topic that I think is close to my heart, but certainly is top of mind for a lot of us, which is burnout on the front line. And the project really started with an observation that if you feel emotionally exhausted at work, if you feel a mental distance from your job or from the people that you're serving or interacting with, and if you feel like you just don't have the professional efficacy anymore to do your work well, then you're not alone, because it turns out that these are all symptoms of employee burnout, and burnout is really quite common. So even before this current pandemic, 1 in 5 Americans reported being burnt out at work. And then if you zoom in on frontline workers, so these are our teachers, our social workers, our correctional officers, the people who we depend on to deliver services effectively and equitably, the burnout rates are really alarmingly high. So about 1 in 2 frontline workers reports being burnt out. And not only is burnout common, it's also very costly, not just to the individuals who are involved, who report both kind of physical and psychological costs, whether that's sickness or sleep problems, coronary heart disease, and other potential challenges. But it's also very costly to organizations and society as a whole. So burnt out employees are much more likely to be absent. They're more likely to turn over. There's some evidence that they're more likely to make mistakes at work. And all of this is costly to society as a whole. So some estimates suggest that having a stressed out, burnt out workforce is costing the US healthcare system up to $190 billion annually. And what's interesting, I think, at least from my perspective, is that even though we have kind of 4 decades of research at this point documenting how serious of an issue burnout is and measuring predictors of burnout, we still don't have a lot of good causal evidence on how to reduce it. And so that's really where my work starts. And just to give you a preview of what I want to talk to you about today, I want to show you first in some survey evidence with Brenda Schiapura that perceived social support is a really critical workplace resource that can buffer against burnout. I'm then going to focus most of my time on a field experiment that was conducted in collaboration with the Behavioral Insights team and Krista Ruffini and Stephanie Wilcoxon, that focuses on actually trying to turn on perceived social support, so increasing perceived social support. And I'll show you that that's going to causally reduce burnout and have resignations. And because in field experiments, a lot of things are happening at the same time, I'm also going to show you some suggestive evidence that the mechanism that I think is working is in fact the mechanism that we see in our intervention. And so through an online experiment, I'm going to show you that we can increase perceived social support and perceptions of belonging by using a very similar treatment than we did in the field. But just to get us started, the research on burnout is really extensive, and I couldn't possibly summarize it all today. So I'm going to lean on a pretty simple conceptual framework for understanding burnout called the Job Demands Resources Model. And the model basically says, look, every job is going to have its own risk factors associated with stress, but we can kind of bucket those risk factors into two broad categories. The first of those categories is job demands. So these are the parts of your job that require sustained cognitive, emotional, or even physical effort. And so when those job demands are high, like if you have a high caseload, if you're working long hours, if you're having emotionally demanding interactions with clients, you're at risk for job strain and exhaustion, and that can lead to burnout. But what is perhaps more interesting for today's conversation is that people who have equally demanding jobs often have varied levels of burnout. And part of that is because they have varied resources available to them to help them cope with that burnout. And so the job resources bucket of this model basically says there are resources that we have at work at varying degrees that not only help us do our job, but also can serve as a buffer against burnout because they help us cope with future high job demands. And one thing that's interesting in this model, or in the buffering hypothesis of this model, is that it's inherently temporal. So what I mean by that is, in this theoretical prediction, if I strengthen job resources today, I should be able to reduce burnout tomorrow. Now, within that space, one of the critical job resources that has received a lot of attention is social support. Now, social support means a lot of things to different people. But if, for example, you ask a teacher, why after years of training did you quit your job in the first 2 years, which almost 40% of teachers do? One thing that they often say is because I was burnt out. And if you ask them, why are you burnt out, or why did you burn out? They won't say because the kids were awful. They'll say because I didn't feel supported, or I didn't have the support of my leadership or of my peers. And so there's this large literature that develops that theoretically predicts a strong association between social support and burnout. Now, it only takes a little bit of digging to see that actually the evidence around this relationship is quite mixed. And so most of the research that we have is correlational, done in surveys. And what we see is that if you actually ask people about the social support that they've received, so you ask them, have you recently received help? And that can be emotional assistance or it can be tangible assistance. Received social support doesn't actually seem to strongly predict better mental health outcomes. Some evidence suggests that there's no association with mental health. Some recent studies suggest there's a negative association with mental health. So receiving more social support is negatively associated with the outcomes that we care about. But in contrast, there's a subset of the literature that talks about perceived social support. Now, perceived social support is the belief that you have someone to go to should you need help, that support is available. And sometimes it's measured through questions like, I have someone at work that I could talk to about my day-to-day problems. So perceived social support doesn't actually require direct interaction. It just requires that you believe that someone has your back should you need them. And it turns out that that is actually much more consistently associated with better mental health outcomes. Now, in the real world, these things are really confounded, right? So if you have a good, strong social network, or if you have good friends at work, you probably have some combination of perceived social support and received social support. And so the interesting question that I like to study in my research is, can we really experimentally manipulate perceived social support without received social support, and then truly test whether or not there's a causal relationship here? At this point, what the literature suggests is that social support, perceived social support, is correlated with burnout, but we don't really know if that means that organizations can actually strengthen social support and that's going to reduce burnout, or if merely, people who are less burnt out, who have less depressive symptoms at work, are more able to perceive social support around them. And so that's really where my work comes in. I'm going to hypothesize that not only does perceived social support reduce burnout, but this is a causal relationship. I'm going to try and strengthen perceived social support by focusing on the foundations of perceived social support: social belonging, group identification, feeling like you're part of a professional group that has your back. And then I'm going to measure whether or not strengthening perceived social support has actual benefits on burnout and resignations. So just to start us off, to share the relationship, the kind of association that we've seen in previous literature, I want to share the results of a survey that we did with my lab and with Brenda Schiapura during COVID. So I was going to say at the peak of COVID, but it's at the first peak of COVID, around April and May of this year. And we surveyed government workers across a whole bunch of different professions, across one city, a state agency. And we measured a few things. The first is we measured these questions of perceived social support. So we asked people to tell us if they have someone at work that they can talk to, whether or not they feel connected to their coworkers. And we also measured a very similar concept, belonging uncertainty, which says when something bad happens, I feel that maybe I don't belong in public service. And the idea here is that if you're unsure of whether or not you belong, then that's going to have impacts on how you think about your self-worth when adversity hits in. And there's a long literature in the educational psychology literature about belonging uncertainty that we're going to draw on for this work on burnout. We have measures of perceived social support. We're also going to measure various forms of psychological distress. We're going to use validated scales, so the GAD-7 to measure anxiety. We're going to use the CFS to measure secondary trauma. And we're also going to use the CFS to measure job burnout. And just to give you a sense of what these relationships look like in this population in March and April of this year, you see a very consistent pattern where people who report having stronger social support, stronger social connections, and less belonging uncertainty also report significantly better mental health outcomes across each of these. So if you have strong social support, you have less anxiety, you have less trauma, you have much less burnout, and the opposite is also true. So if you feel uncertain about whether or not you even belong in public service, you're going to have higher anxiety, higher trauma, and higher burnout. And I think this is critical to look at during a time of crisis like COVID, where people are really scrambling to do their work and do their work well. But I could have shown you similar results with other populations pre-COVID. I could show it with health workers. We've now done this type of survey with multiple populations across various timelines, and the pattern is really quite stark. So the trend lines are very similar. So with that in mind, we know that there is some sort of strong relationship between social support, specifically perceived social support, and burnout. And I want to turn us to the field experiment, which is probably the more interesting part of today's conversation. So in order to really measure what happens in the field, you need a population that is burnt out. And for this project, we worked with 911 dispatchers. So 911 dispatchers are the people who pick up the phone when you call the police in the US. And they're such an interesting professional group because on the one hand, they're picking up hundreds of calls a day, facing other people's trauma and other people's difficult moments. So they have to manage their own emotions as well as the other person's emotions. They're making split-second decisions that are truly life or death decisions. where it's really important to be clear and calm and collected. And yet, they're treated as though they are call center workers. For reasons that are kind of bonkers, they don't get the same social status as firefighters or other first responders. They don't get the same mental health services as other first responders. And so even though they're facing either the same levels of trauma or even higher levels of trauma in their day-to-day work, they don't get that kind of group identity or professional identity that says, our work matters and people really understand what we're going through. And so it's no wonder that really they have really high levels of burnout, really high levels of absenteeism, and really high levels of turnover. Now, I should say, I had a big spiel about how they're the unsung heroes of law enforcement. I still think that's true, but there's now a show called 911 about dispatchers. So this could change over time in terms of how people feel about their work. So to run this study in a collaboration with What Works Cities and the Behavioral Insights team, we worked with 9 mid-sized cities across the US. And what we did is we sent emails to our treatment group every week for 6 weeks. The purpose of these emails was to encourage participants to both read and share stories with their peers. And the purpose of the stories was to help build the sense that not only did they have advice to give that could help other people in their co-working space, so other dispatchers, but also there's this professional group that exists across all these cities that kind of understands what you're going through. And so if you're trying to build perceived social support, at its foundation, we wanted to affirm this group identification and to affirm belonging to this group, because it seems like that's kind of the first step to believing that other people have your back or other people know what you're going through. And so these emails every week, we're asking people to share their experience or give advice, all geared towards connecting with other dispatchers. And as people shared their stories in kind of follow-up weeks after the first week, we also shared somebody else's story. So you would get an email that said, last week, Diana said XYZ. This week, I want you to share your story on a new topic related to social connectedness. And then we measured 3 outcomes: burnout using the Copenhagen Burnout Inventory, which is a validated scale, sick leave, and resignations. And we measured it at baseline, immediately after the intervention, so 6 weeks later, as well as 4 months after that. So we have kind of an intermediary outcome measure as well as a final outcome measure. And we're not going to have time to go through all of this, so I can get to the Q&A, but these are the kinds of prompts that we were using. These are the nudges. So they say things like, think about what would make a coworker a great mentor. Who would you recommend as a mentor? Or what advice would you give to a new recruit about what it's like to be on the job? So all of these are kind of different ways of building the sense that you're part of this community, that you understand this community, and that other people are experiencing what you're experiencing at work. And the stories themselves are going onto this anonymous platform. Think of this as like your least techie kind of version of a Facebook group of some sort, where they can read other people's stories. And this is important because even if you don't want to participate by sharing your own stories, you can still read other people's stories and feel part of the group. And so, the sharing of the stories on this common platform anonymously, I think is a critical part of the intervention. So for the sake of time, I'm going to jump straight to results. First, let me show you results on burnout itself. So as I mentioned, we're measuring burnout using the Copenhagen Burnout Inventory that has 3 components. It has work burnout, personal burnout, and client burnout. Across each of these axes and overall, we see a statistically significant reduction in burnout that is pretty consistent until 4 months post-intervention, which is, I think, the more surprising part of this. So if you look at kind of that final measure, we see about an 8-point reduction on the CBI scale. And to give you a sense of what that means, that's approximately the difference between the average scores for social workers and the average scores for administrative staff in previous studies. So think of that as a benchmark. You'll note that 911 dispatchers are much higher in terms of their average burnout scores, but a 8-point reduction is a significant reduction in burnout. And if you prefer regressions, these are just the same results. In regression format, we see a pretty consistent reduction that's statistically significant on burnout 4 months after all the emails are sent. What is, I think, most exciting for organizations that look at this research is that we also see an effect post-intervention on resignations. So these are Kaplan-Meier curves that look at likelihood of survival or quitting over the 26 weeks. So we have 6 weeks of intervention, and then we have this 4-month period post-intervention. Now, the reduction that we see in resignations is strongest in that 4-month period post-intervention. We can talk about why that is if you're interested. But because in the 6 months period, the control group mean in terms of turnover is about 5%, a reduction of about 3.3 percentage point is essentially cutting our resignations by more than half. And to think about kind of the cost of the intervention, which is just sending a bunch of emails, compared to the cost of turnover, which is incredibly high in this sample, the cost effectiveness of this type of approach becomes really intriguing to organizations. As many of you know, training frontline workers is incredibly expensive. And so one person quitting costs the organization probably around 16 months or so of salary. So more than a year's worth of salary. And so if you can reduce resignations, even by a little bit, you can have real cost savings for the organization as a whole. Now, as I mentioned, field experiments are field experiments. And so there are a lot of things happening at the same time here. For example, we're sending people emails. So it's possible that just the act of sending people emails is improving their mental health, and it's not the content of those emails that matters. Or, there's a growing literature about the importance of giving advice. Some of our email prompts were framed around giving advice to a newbie. So it's possible that it was just the advice giving that is causing these results, as opposed to the social belonging component that I'm focusing on, or this perceived social support that I'm focusing on. So to start to disentangle that, we ran a Mturk trial, so an online experiment, where we pulled out 1 week of these prompts. So this is week 5 in our treatment. And just to remind you what it says, imagine a new recruit just started at your current workplace, and they tell you, I just got hired, I'm excited, I'm nervous. Do you have any suggestions? How would you describe your office culture to a newbie? How do you and your coworkers support each other? So this is really pushing the social support component of this and asking you to reflect on social connectedness. And it's framed as a piece of advice. To create a comparable control group that doesn't include the social connectedness and the group identification, the control group in this Mturk experiment also was asked to imagine a scenario where they had to give advice. In this case, we said, imagine a friend's teenager is starting a new school, they're nervous and excited. What advice would you give to them for succeeding at their new school? So there's no reason for us to believe that you feel, as a full-time worker, some sort of group identification or some sort of social connection to a teenager that's starting high school, but the other components of the intervention are the same. And what we can see in this study is that the treatment, so the prompt that we used in our field experiment, does seem to increase across a whole bunch of different axes, your sense of social support, your sense that you belong, your sense that you have someone to talk to, your sense of connectedness. And kind of the last column is just an index of all the different measures that we used. And so this is by no means complete evidence that the mechanism is what we think it is, but at least it is suggestive evidence that we're moving in the right direction. And I'd love to talk to you more about other ways that we can test the mechanism on this experiment. But let me conclude with kind of where we are now and where we want to go. So we have some preliminary evidence that belonging affirmation interventions can reduce burnout among frontline workers, and importantly, they can significantly reduce turnover. And so what we're doing now is replicating this with larger samples and with different types of frontline workers. I'm also particularly interested in nailing the mechanism. I think this is about perceived social support and kind of group identification and belonging affirmation as the foundations for perceived social support, but would love to talk to you more about that. We're also interested in looking at kind of what happens next. So if you can reduce burnout, yes, you have this huge potential benefit for organizations in terms of resignations. Can we also make a causal link between burnout and decision making. And that sounds like an obvious point, but we actually don't have any good causal evidence that that's the case in either direction. So we don't have evidence that reducing burnout causally impacts decision making. We also don't have great evidence that higher employee engagement and improving employee engagement at work causes better performance, especially in the public sector. And then a third area that I'm hoping to explore is, what is it about frontline workers that leads to such high burnout early on? One thing that I find fascinating is that actually burnout peaks very early on in people's careers in the first few years. And so, what are we doing in how we set expectations for the frontline, whether that's for teachers or for social workers or for health workers or nurses, that sets them up to fail quite quickly in terms of burnout. And so I'm interested in thinking about interventions that adjust people's expectations about what the job is going to be like in the hopes that that allows us to retain more people over time. So let me stop there and thank you. I'm really excited for our conversation, but this is my email address if you have other questions after the talk.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That was wonderful. Terrific talk. We do have a bunch of questions here that I'd like to get to, but because I'm the one talking and it's my prerogative, I'd like to satisfy a couple of my own curiosities first.
Sure.
I really liked your effort to ensure that it was the content of the email, of course, that was responsible for the effects. But there was heterogeneity in the prompts that you used. Did you have any evidence that some of the emails that were produced by those prompts would be more effective than others?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The only evidence that we have at this stage is which ones people liked responding to most. Now, that is not the same as measuring impact or effectiveness. So it turns out that I think it was week 2, this is kind of much more in line with what you would see normally in a government environment. So the prompt that asked people to think about what makes a good mentor and who they would recommend as a mentor and why they would be great, we got the most responses to that. There are many reasons why that might be the case. It could be the content, it could be that it was week 2. We'll know in follow-up studies. But if my theory is right, that this is really about building this kind of group identification or affirming belonging to this professional group, then it's not any one message that is going to reduce stress enough. It's that you're building the sense that you have people that you could go to who understand what you're going through. And so you would require kind of multiple versions of that before you create kind of this buffering effect that's going to lead to improvements over time.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I'm going to do one more and then I'll move over to the chat. Obviously, you have storytellers and you have story receivers, and you're very much focused on the story receivers, but you identified that there is an advice-giving literature, and I do wonder to what extent you think that the mere act of prompting somebody to tell these kinds of stories might result in similar effects, if not reducing burnout.
Yeah, I think there's certainly, I would certainly believe, given the advice-giving literature and given what we see in this experiment, that prompting people to give advice is better for the advice giver sometimes than the advice receiver, and has these mental health benefits. One of the reasons we chose to frame some of our nudges that way is because we thought that it was also possibly true that just getting people to reflect on their belonging to this community, the fact that they're part of this community would be great, but how do you convince a bunch of really busy, burnt out people to take a moment and think? Like, we have this evidence on journaling and other types of efforts to like write down your feelings, but it felt to me that might be perceived as too squishy. And what we could turn to instead is this really innate feeling in a lot of public servants that they want to make a difference and help people. And so if you can't help the public, because the public is not going to value what you do, maybe you can help new recruits, right? And so you can kind of build on this existing ethos in the public service to be helpful and support each other, but just redirect it to helping your peers as opposed to helping beneficiaries. That being said, we're still thinking through like, how do you convince people to reflect on their social connections in different ways. So hopefully I'll have more evidence on that soon.
No, thank you. That was a great answer. I'm going to move into the Q&A here. I've been hogging up too much airtime. Let's start with a question from my colleague and friend Renate. He asks, and I think that this was from very, very early on in the presentation, might the negative association with received social support be due to people not receiving the support until it's too late?
Yeah, that's just a really good question. Because a lot of the research that we have about social support and burnout up until this point is correlational, one answer is by the time you're receiving help, you're already depressed or anxious or burnt out, and so it's too late. So that's certainly one possibility. Another possibility that has been looked at a little bit in this literature is that when you receive help, a couple of things are happening. One is you receive help. The other is that you've signaled to somebody else that you need help. And so if there's shame or kind of discomfort associated with having to tell someone else that you are in need of help, that could push you in the other direction. So there's some really interesting predictions that say it's not that received help is bad, is that it is both received and perceived. So that if you could provide invisible social support, like you just do things for people to make their life easier and they don't have to kind of come to terms with the fact that they need help, maybe we do have improved mental health outcomes. But it is kind of, the reason I find this area really interesting, Renante, is that most of the stuff that we do at work is built around the belief that received social support is going to make a difference, whether that's buddy programs or mentorship programs or kind of direct peer support. But we don't really have any good evidence that that's going to improve mental health outcomes for one reason or another. But certainly your hypothesis is one that I would trust.
Perfect. I mean, yeah, it always just reminds, you always just think you never appreciate what you've got until it's gone. And so it all kind of fits into that for me. I'm colloquializing, you'll have to forgive me. We'll move on to the next question here. How much of burnout reduction do you believe will come from structural change in how our jobs are organized versus low-cost nudges like adjusting perceived social support?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And if I'm allowed to, I'm going to expand it more to say, like, where is the role of nudges in all sorts of problems or social challenges that we're trying to face compared to systemic reforms? I don't have a good answer. My intuition is that there is a lot that we could improve if we could change kind of the fundamental nature of the work, right? So if we could triple the number of social workers that are available so that caseloads go down, or if we could give people time between calls or between traumatic events to regroup, or if we just paid people more so that the rest of their life was easier, all of those things certainly should have effects, significant effects on things like burnout. The reason I don't focus on those is partly because I love thinking about what works in government settings. And so I want to think about what's feasible today to help people who are burnt out today. And some of those things are off the table. However, it does seem that even in kind of high status professions, like if you think about surgeons or other kind of well-paid physicians, burnout rates are still really high there. So there might be something more than just job demands that is causing these levels of burnout. So I don't want to create a hierarchy where like social support and caring about your peers is like below reducing work hours. We don't actually know that that's true. But I certainly think that nudges are not going to solve the world's problems. And I write about this a lot in other places. But they are something that we can do today that seems to be making a difference.
Perfect. I got a question from Tim Dirksen here. This looks like it's a little bit more specific. In experiment 2, was there any difference between those that actively participated, showing and engaging, and those who passively participated? As a bit of a follow-up here, relative to the findings regarding happiness with social media for active versus passive users.
Yeah, this is such a good question. Unfortunately, I don't know. The nature of the experiment was that it was anonymous, and so we can't link back individual stories in this version to individual people. So I can't tell you whether or not, if you actively participated, your rates are higher However, it wouldn't surprise me if that were the case. It's a really interesting world, this world of mental health, that I'm trying to understand more of. There's some research that suggests that like talking to a machine allows you to say things that you wouldn't say to another person, which is really related to kind of the social media world, like talking to a Facebook group where you don't actually know the other people, allows people to be much more open about mental health issues. But if I'm right that part of this is about feeling like you belong to a group and it's about perceived social support, passive participation should also allow you to feel like you have someone that you could go to should you need them in the future.
Sorry, I was muted there. Tim's got another question, so we'll follow up. We'll satisfy Tim's curiosity here. Is there any correlation between burnout and EQ? The jobs you seem to study likely require higher EQ, and it would seem that empathy is extremely taxing.
Let me say something that's related, but not exactly EQ. So it is certainly the case that when burnout started becoming a field of study, the focus was on professions that require direct interaction with people in this form. So for example, professions where you're likely to have compassion fatigue, exactly in the same way that you talk about empathy being really taxing. Social workers, nurses, those types of professions. And we have some evidence that that in itself is a risk factor for burnout. But I don't, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I don't know if people who kind of score more highly on EQ measures report lower burnout. What we do know is that one coping mechanism that people have in these professions is to depersonalize, right? And that's kind of a factor related to burnout. So my kind of gut reaction to that is that if you were to empathize daily and deeply with your clients as a frontline worker, you would be more likely to burn out and quit faster. And so a coping mechanism that we see over time for a lot of frontline workers is not being non-empathetic, but just kind of keeping a distance, which we can call depersonalization or kind of a mental distance between the worker and the client.
I'm going to go with a question that's also kind of broad, but I think it's interesting. How does self-efficacy factor into this equation? Very, very broadly construed, I presume.
So I think self-efficacy is key, really key. So if we think about these three predictors of burnout, or excuse me, three characterizations of burnout, one is about emotional exhaustion, the second is about depersonalization, the third is really about self-efficacy. So depending on who you ask, it's either called lack of personal accomplishment, or, you know, there's various versions. It's basically self-efficacy. And I think, and I have some evidence that these types of interventions are operating on that third axis of self-efficacy. So what they're doing is they're saying, I feel like I'm part of this group. I feel more connected to other people. I feel like I belong in this job that I'm in. And we know since, like, I don't know, Mead 1934, that our sense of self-worth and our sense of social identity is so dependent on our social relationships. And so our sense that we can handle adversity might be linked to belonging to this group. So I think self-efficacy is really the channel through which burnout is reduced. I have some evidence of that. So we've done some work that it hasn't been published yet on health workers that are actually part of these online Facebook groups, very similar to this, but the fancier version. And we asked them to reflect on social, like how socially connected they are with other people in their Facebook group in a very similar intervention to what I just showed you. And we measure a significant increase on self-efficacy as one of the kind of the three dimensions of burnout. So I do think that's the underlying mechanism. You feel like you can handle things that come your way if you feel like someone has your back.
Makes a lot of sense to me. Well, the next question here. I'm just reading out these verbatim. I don't want to misquote anybody or misinterpret anybody. Would belonging affirmation also be the key mechanism in other populations where burnout is a problem? For example, students.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the answer is yes. So actually, there's a large literature about belonging uncertainty and belonging in general on students. In fact, all we know about belonging uncertainty comes from work on students. Is usually linked to performance. And so there the argument on like student tests. There the argument is if I feel, for example, like I don't belong in college or I don't belong in a STEM degree, I am more anxious in ways that creates an identity threat, right? And then I perform worse. So if I feel like I belong more, I don't I don't link the difficulty or the challenge of the test with my self-worth. And so I do better. I imagine if we did exactly that same type of experiment but measured burnout, we would see similar results with students as well.
Oh, I like this one because it kind of appeals to me as a researcher. So you talked about a very interesting intervention today that I think obviously could be very, very useful for a number of different reasons. Is there something that you'd really like to try in this space that you haven't had a chance to yet, that you think might be extremely effective?
On burnout?
Yeah,
Or
on burnout.
This actually goes back to one of the previous questions. One thing that I would love to try, which is very different. Well, there's two things that I want to try. One is just giving people time. If I could convince anyone to just give frontline workers time that they can do whatever they want with and kind of build autonomy over their day, even if it's a small amount of time. I don't think it's the actual time that's improving things, it's just the autonomy. I think that could have significant effects on burnout. The other thing is this idea about expectation. So if we can reframe what it means to be impactful for frontline workers away from beneficiaries, like you're not going to go save the children if you become a teacher, but you can support each other. I think that could also be really effective. But what I'm most excited about is research that then links whatever intervention we do around burnout to decision making, so actual improvements in service delivery. And that might mean more equitable service delivery, like less bias in decision making. It could mean just like better performance in cases where you can measure things like productivity rates or error rates. But I'm excited to try to link outcomes from like kind of the employee side to the service delivery side, because I feel like there's a whole world of people who don't really care about improving work conditions for employees that would be excited about it if we could show that it then actually affects service delivery.
Yeah, I totally agree. Definitely a lot of potential there. I just have people asking where they can find your research. I think that you should just plug that in right now. They're very interested in being able to reference these primary materials.
Sure. So there are a bunch of places you can go. So one is you can always email me. You can learn a little bit more about what we're doing at my lab. It's peoplelab.berkeley.edu. The website will at some point be refreshed to have all these things, but email me if you can't find anything. And some of this is currently kind of going through the regular academic review process. So we have a few papers on burnout that are currently under review. And so hopefully you'll be able to hear more about these studies as well as other studies that are currently on embargo around this topic in the next few months.
Wonderful. I think that addresses that question. Okay, similar questions. I feel like there's a lot of similar questions going on here. I actually don't want to keep you on this call too long today, Elizabeth, because I do know that you have to go to another, you have to give another talk in like 25 minutes or thereabouts. So in the interest of wrapping up a little bit early so you can get to what you need to go to, are there any parting words that you would like to have for our audience today?
Oh, that's a great question. I have lots of parting words, depending on who's in the audience, which I don't exactly know. One is I want to celebrate for our field experiment, for example, that we worked with 9 cities and got them all to do the same intervention. And those of you who have tried to run randomized control trials in the field know that that is near impossible. So I want to celebrate the work that the Behavioral Insights team has done to kind of build the norm around doing evidence-based policymaking with real government partners. And I want to celebrate the partners themselves for kind of putting up with this approach. So if you're interested in kind of that type of work, there are a lot of us now who are doing collaborative research, and I think it's really powerful. So that's one thing. The second is that for reasons that I don't fully understand, my research always becomes more relevant after I start doing it. So clearly, people are struggling during the pandemic or during this period, not only because of the pandemic, but because of all the other things that have happened in 2020. And so I urge you to think about frontline workers, health workers, nurses, but also the people who are processing UI claims and the people who are dealing with all sorts of after effects of unemployment and empathize because they're really struggling right now at levels that we've never seen before. So I'll leave with that happy thought and definitely let me know if there's anything else that comes up or if you have any questions.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That's a very nice humanitarian note to end on today. Yeah, thanks again for coming. Best of luck in your talk in just a few moments here. For everybody else, I'll let you know that a full recording of this webinar is available on our website by clicking the side tab labeled Events and then clicking the sub tab labeled Bear Webinar Series. Our next webinar is going to be held on Thursday, January 21st in the new year, at which point we'll hear from Dr. Nina Mazar, Professor of Marketing at Boston University. Thanks, everybody, for attending today. A special thanks to you, Elizabeth, and you can all exit this webinar by closing your Zoom screen. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks.